This is the story of the American muscle car. How it was born, how it ruled the road, and how it died. It is a story of horsepower and freedom, of ambition and excess. And it is a story of how the most exciting cars America ever built were strangled in just a few short years. To understand the fall, you first have to understand the rise. It begins in the early 1960s, on the wide-open highways of post-war America. The country was booming. Gas was cheap. And a new generation wanted to go fast. Detroit had stumbled onto a simple, intoxicating formula. Take a big, powerful V8. Then drop it into a smaller, lighter body. The result was raw, brutal speed that an ordinary worker could actually afford. In 1964, Pontiac slipped a huge V8 into a mid-size coupe, and called it the GTO. On paper, it broke the company's own rules about engine size. In the showroom, it was a sensation. The GTO sold far past every prediction, and Detroit took notice. Within a year, every rival was racing to build one of their own. Ford, Dodge, Plymouth, Chevrolet. Suddenly everyone was fighting the same war. A horsepower war. And the prize was the wallet of young America. Detroit's advertising leaned into the danger, selling raw power to restless youth. Each year the engines grew bigger, the numbers climbed higher, and the names grew louder. The Charger. The Chevelle. The Roadrunner. The Barracuda. The Mustang. These were not luxury cars. They were weapons, sold to teenagers with a driver's license. Every weekend, main streets and drag strips turned into open-air battlegrounds. Bragging rights were settled in a quarter mile, between two sets of taillights. In 1970, the muscle car reached its absolute peak. Chevrolet's Chevelle could be ordered with a 450 horsepower big block V8. Chrysler's legendary 426 Hemi was rated at 425 horsepower. These were staggering numbers, sold to the public for the price of a family sedan. On any given weekend, these machines lined up at drag strips across the nation. For a brief, golden moment, cheap horsepower was the American dream on four wheels. It was loud, it was dangerous, and it felt like it would last forever. But 1970 was not just the peak. It was the beginning of the end. Because dreams built on cheap gasoline are fragile things. For separate forces were about to collide, all at once. Together, they would kill the muscle car in less than 5 years. The first force was quiet, and it came from an unexpected place. The insurance office. Young men were buying the fastest cars in the country, and then crashing them. The accident rates on high-powered cars were catastrophic. Insurance companies responded the only way they knew how. They raised the price. A powerful V8 could now cost far more to insure than an ordinary economy car. For the young buyers at the heart of the movement, the numbers stopped making sense. Surcharges were added to any car with a big engine and a bold name. Very things that made a muscle car exciting now made it unaffordable to insure. Slowly, quietly, the young buyers began to walk away. The second force was far louder, and it came from the other side of the world. In October of 1973, the oil crisis hit. Major oil producers cut supply, and the price of crude oil roughly quadrupled almost overnight. In America, the effect was chaos. Long lines formed at the pumps. Fuel was rationed. In many states, you could only buy gas on certain days. At the pump, the price of a gallon jumped to record highs. And the muscle car had one fatal weakness. It drank fuel like water. A car built to burn gasoline became a car nobody could afford to feed. Overnight, the giant V8 changed from a symbol of freedom into a symbol of waste. Suddenly, Americans wanted one thing from a car. Miles per gallon. The muscle car offered the exact opposite, at the worst possible moment. The third force came from Washington, and it was written into law. For years, American cities had been choking under a thick blanket of smog. On the last day of 1970, the government signed the Clean Air Act. Law demanded a 90% cut in harmful vehicle emissions by 1975. For engineers, that was an almost impossible target in just a few years. To meet it, they were forced to choke the very engines that made muscle cars special. Compression was lowered so engines could run on cleaner, unleaded fuel. Timing was softened. Power was sacrificed for survival. The effect on horsepower was brutal, and the numbers tell the whole story. In 1970, the Pontiac GTO's big V8 was rated at 366 horsepower. By 1974, that same engine produced just 200. The fire-breathing monster had lost nearly half of its power in 4 years. Corvette's celebrated LT-1 engine tells the same grim story. In 1970, it made 370 horsepower on high compression. A year later, softened for cleaner fuel, its real output fell toward the mid-200s. Part of that drop was on paper. The industry changed how it measured horsepower. It switched from an idealized lab number to a real-world figure, and the numbers fell. But part of the loss was painfully real, caused by the fight to pass emissions. Either way, the badges still bragged, but the performance behind them was fading fast. The fourth force was the economy itself. The oil crisis helped push America into a deep recession. Families tightened their budgets. Big, thirsty, expensive cars were the first to go. And waiting in the wings were the imports. Small, cheap, reliable cars from Japan that sipped fuel instead of guzzling it. Models like the Honda Civic could travel roughly 40 miles on a single gallon. To a nation traumatized by gas lines, that was not boring. It was salvation. Detroit, caught flat-footed, had no small cars ready to answer them. Import sales soared, while muscle car showrooms fell silent. Insurance. Oil. Emissions. Recession. 4 forces, 1 victim. By the mid-1970s, the golden age was simply over. The great engines were turned into shadows of what they had been. Some legendary names survived, but only as stickers on slow, heavy cars. Badge that once promised danger now promised disappointment. Historians would later call this grim stretch the malaise era. A decade when American performance nearly flatlined completely. The cars that had defined a generation were now used, unloved, and cheap. Many were driven hard, wrecked, or simply scrapped for the metal. Nobody imagined they were throwing away future fortunes. Because the muscle car did not truly die. It went into hiding. In garages and barns, a handful of survivors waited, quietly, for decades. Years later, restorers began hunting the survivors, rebuilding them bolt by bolt. Original cars with their factory engines intact became the ultimate prize. And the children who had grown up hearing those engines had grown rich. They wanted the dream of their youth back. And they were willing to pay. At collector auctions, prices for original muscle cars began to climb. Cars that once sold for a few $1,000s now brought 6 figures, then 7. Consider the 1971 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible. With the mighty Hemi engine, only a tiny handful were ever built that year. That rarity turned a used muscle car into one of the most valuable cars on earth. One example sold at auction for $3.5 million. Another later drew a bid of nearly $5 million, and still didn't meet the reserve. A car once dismissed as a gas-guzzling relic had become automotive royalty. So remember how the story really ends. The muscle car never lost a fair fight on the road. It was strangled, slowly, by gas, by law, by fear, and by money. And then, decades later, it rose from the ashes worth more than ever before. These are the gasoline ghosts. The legends that lived fast, and refused to stay dead. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, and ride with us into the next one.